Hi, everyone, and welcome. Thanks for attending. As Andrew mentioned, tonight we're discussing the classic book, Practical Object-Oriented Design in Ruby by Sandi Metz. And we're very happy and pleased to be joined by Sandi Metz and three other panelists, Joe Leo, Justin Shultz, and Li-Hsuan. The panelists will introduce themselves, and then we will open the floor for a Q&A and discussion. So Sandi, you want to start us off?
Oh, sure. I'm Sandi Metz. I wrote a book. I am a woman of a certain age. I spent my whole life writing code, and now I think about writing code rather than writing code mostly. That's probably all you need to know about me. You know I have a dog. You were here when that happened.
Joe?
Yeah, hi everybody. I'm Joe. I run a company called Deaf Method, and it's an agile consultancy. We solve significant, meaningful challenges. I started writing Ruby in 2009. I'm the co-author of the 3rd edition of the Well-Grounded Rubyist, and I'm a former organizer of the Gotham Ruby Conference. I wore the shirt, and it's not really on camera, but that's me. And that's not me. That was me and a lot of other people. And I live here in New York City.
Great. Justin?
Hi, I'm Justin Shultz. So I most recently was working as a lead consultant developer with Stride Consulting, and now I'm taking a little bit of a sabbatical. I got into programming through the App Academy. Well, I taught myself for a while, and then I went to App Academy boot camp. And the first book I read out was Pooter. So really excited to be talking about here. And I think probably my proudest moment in my programming career was when I was in a workshop with you through Stride, Sandi, where I was driving, and I did some Vim magic and got a standing ovation for it. Now, I say that jokingly because Tim Pope should get the credit. And also, I think I was trying your patience by trying to change too many things at once, which is a habit that I've improved since that. Yeah, I think this book is a great first thing for someone to read when they first get the basics of programming under their belt.
Awesome. Li-Hsuan Lung, are you? I haven't found you in the names yet, in the faces yet. Are you here with us?
Here.
Yep, I'm here. So
go.
first of all, Richard,
Hi.
I'm just very impressed by your pronunciation of my name. That's like so on point. Do you speak Chinese? That's amazing.
This took a lot of practice. No, I just wanted to make sure I didn't get it terribly wrong. So I'm glad that sounds correct.
That's perfect. So my name is Li-Hsuan. I'm currently an engineering manager at Fieldwire. It's a company based in San Francisco. We're in construction. We're hiring. Before this, I was with a company called A-Flight. We had a apprenticeship program, and we use this book a lot in our programs to help new developers learn how to write code. It's a pleasure to be here.
Awesome. Well, we're just so happy to have you guys here and all the attendees. So with that, we'll just open up the floor for questions and answers from the panelists. Just, unmute yourself and ask away or type a question in the chat. So I'll just throw out a question while just to get things going. I have a few of my own favorite sort of things I would like to know and get an opinion on. This one comes up, when I read the work from Joe and from Sandi. If you had an organization that really wanted to culturally change and improve the quality of their code, how might you guide them? Is it something? Do you think organizations either have that culture or they don't? Or is it something you can create? Anybody?
Sandi, you want to start that one off?
I'm going to unmute myself and go. the short answer is yes, you can create it. The longer answer is you have to really you have to want to. Okay, so I wrote code for tons of years at places where, I went to work every day and worked on an app. And then when I wrote that book, it was like a bomb went off in my life and I started traveling and teaching. And so it was a really different perspective when I went in shop after shop after shop, like 10 or 12 or 15 or 20 places a year, and saw how they were doing business. And so I got to see a lot of places that worked and a lot of places that didn't work. And one of it's hard to know, like you have to be a little careful about taking me too seriously because it's a selected group, right? People call me for a reason and they might all be calling me for the same reason. So you have to like take it with a grain of salt, what I'm about to say. But I noticed some patterns after a number of years of doing that. And one of them was that, first of all, I hate leaving the house, so I wasn't cheap, which meant that the management, the people who were paying the bills, already had made a large commitment to code quality because they were willing to pay for someone like me to come in, and they were willing to stop business for a number of days and have everybody write code. And so there's a sign right there of a deep desire on the part of the people who pay money to improve the quality of software. All right, so we have that cue. But then the other thing that would happen was almost without exception, programmers would constantly talk about feeling under time pressure that kept them from doing their best work. And I suspect that all of you feel that same thing. You feel that pressure every day at your job, which makes you feel as if you have to make compromises in the quality of code because something about the situation you're in demands it. And so part of what I did, it turned out that I did, in many places I taught OO, but in lots of places I did therapy. That was really what they wanted from me. They needed therapy. And one thing is to bridge that gap between what management says they want and what programmers feel like they're being told they have to do. And what I find, like I've sat on the boss side of the table, but I feel more closely aligned to the dev side of the table. And what I do for myself, and what I suspect that most of you do, is that I would make compromises in advance of being asked for them. I would write bad code because I thought I had to write fast code. I didn't think anybody would. I thought I would be in trouble if I took a fraction longer and wrote good code. And okay, so one thing is here's the thing, here's the advice that I finally started giving people. When you look at something in code, here, let me say this. If you as a programmer feel as if you're under time pressure all the time, and so that you're always compromising on the quality of code, if you were to go to product or your bosses or whoever it is that's given you assignments, if you were to go to them and say this, you could tell them, I can do the fastest thing possible every time you ask me for a feature, and it will be crap. And over time, that crap will accumulate such that we can no longer make any changes in your code. Like, that's one choice. I can do that for you. Or alternatively, I could spend a little more time every time I touch the code, and such that the code base gets better over time and that our velocity stays high and we can keep on making changes you want. Like, which one does product choose? Nobody ever says, please write crap all the time and drive my business into the ground. And yet very often as developers, we do that without even asking them. We make that choice for them. And so one thing that's important to do is understand that you're probably your worst enemy, and that since you know that all the devs are their own worst enemies about feeling time pressure, you have to support each other in taking a little more time in writing good code. And what that means is when you look at code during code review and you wish they'd done something different, when they've just like put another branch in a conditional or written some crap that's going to harm the code base, you should ask them, did you think of doing anything else? Like, don't complain about their code, but if you ask them, did you consider anything else? And people will often say, oh, I kind of did, but I just didn't feel like we had time. And then you can give each other permission. You can say, well, I think there is a little time to do that. Why don't you go look at that? All right. So that's one thing, like at the level we are, at the dev level, like quit usurping the decision from the people who are spending money about how much time there actually is. Now, I can give you a bunch of counter arguments, right? I'm going to give a few and then I'm going to shut up. I have been places where people got evaluated based on how many tickets they took off the backlog. All right. If you're in a place that has a reward scheme that's set up like that, what they're asking for is crap code. And in a place like that, I would just leave. Like, you don't have enough power. Like, if you're in an organization that thinks that's a good idea, there's so many fundamental flaws about that organization that where we sit in the power hierarchy, it might be really tough to fix. I don't think you can fix it. And so in those organizations, what I see is the senior debt, like new management comes in and they want metrics. So they decide they're going to start measuring stuff and they decide it's going to be tickets. And so people start gaming that system right away. They either break one ticket up into a bunch of tiny little tickets so they can say they did a whole bunch of tickets, or they write bad code. One or the other happens. And then gradually all the senior devs leave and then they're left with junior devs who don't know how to write good code. Like, the mess is so big they can't fix it. All right, so let me back up and see if I can make a coherent phrase or two out of what I just said. Culture is super important, and this comes out of culture. And the culture's the way you write good code is you have trust between all the levels of the hierarchy about what people's intentions are. Like, the management thinks that developers, they don't think you're prima donnas that just want perfection. They think you care about the business and you have it in mind. And the way you get them, I mean, this is an agile thing. The way you get the people who are making decisions, spending the money, to believe in your good intentions is you give them the opportunity to make decisions about how to spend money. You go to them and you say, I can do a crap thing and get it done today if we need it, and I'm willing to do that. I can do a slightly nicer thing and it will maybe pay off in a week or two. We've had this problem for a while, and if we spend a week or two on it, we can save money over a time frame of like 6 or 8 months. But it means that everybody has to believe like, this is another agile metaphor, right? Everybody has to agree that they're in the same boat and they're going to bail if there's a hole. And so if you're in a situation like that where people are willing to collaborate and willing to communicate, you can have this kind of world. If you're not, you should go somewhere else. People pay you good money to do your best work. Find a place where you can. Okay, I'm done. I would be super interested in, Joe.
That's
Justin.
really well said.
Mhm.
So, like Sandy, I've been at a lot of places. I've been in services for almost my entire professional career. And so I've seen like every kind of team. And so my initial answer before Sandy said anything was, well, you kind of have to have some support at the programmer level and at the boss level, because I've come to organizations where, like Sandy mentioned, well, the management shells out a whole bunch of money because they think that it's important to, or at least they say, they're saying at that time, well, hey, we think it's important that you all learn to write good code, right? But and then maybe that's the case, and maybe it's not. Maybe their actions aren't really supporting that. But in either case, it's like, well, management pays for it. The programmers, or at least the most senior programmers, aren't really bought in, which leads to kind of this mess. I mean, the effect of having people come in and teach, and a lot of the ways we teach right now is just by sitting down and writing code with people. That dissipates when we leave, and that's never what we want. On the flip side, you can have the more common thing, which is that engineers are genuinely trying to do better, or at least craft better code. They push management to get somebody like us in the door, but management's not really supporting it. They're just doing it because they think that'll, if they pay
shut
for
them up.
Yeah, pay for it once, it'll shut them up. Yeah, that's exactly right. So you do need, I really love the idea of using Agile as a metaphor. The communication between management and between developers is incredibly important. And it doesn't, the thing that makes it hard is that it has to happen more than once. It's got to happen like a lot, because when you give that example, hey, I could do a really crappy job today and you'll pay for it, or down the line, or I can or I could take a little bit more time. The natural question from a business stakeholder is, well, how much is it going to cost me? Right? And is there a return on that investment? Which is not something that you should say yes or no to, because this is a trick question, but it is something that you should be able to have an ongoing dialogue about, because then it shows that you're invested in the business and in the outcomes of the company. And that breaks the idea that can be wrongly held, and hopefully isn't held that widely, which is like, well, my programmers are just a bunch of perfectionists and, you know, nothing is ever good enough for them. You know, and it's true, nothing is really ever good enough. There is a huge creative element to writing code, which means that as creatives, I mean, most creatives I know don't feel great about the work, even when it's a finished product, even when it's bound into their book and put out. It's like, well, if I had a little more time, I'd probably do it better, right? I know that's how I felt in the past. But there is, and that's the thing I love about the book, the Pooter book, is that it's constantly evaluated. It teaches you to constantly evaluate the trade-offs. You know, let's see if we can push this decision off just a little bit further. And by doing that, create a better design, a more flexible design. So I think I went off on a tangent there, but yeah, I do think the change is possible. I do think it takes an ongoing commitment, and it requires dialogue on both sides of the fence, in the boss chair and in the programmer chair.
Can I add something to this question? And just, you know, whoever wants to weigh in, you know, when you talk about cost, how do you really, you know, effectively quantify that for the people that are spending the money in a way that you know, makes sense to both your team and your management?
I mean, I just don't think you can. Like, we don't have good metrics that let us, like, if we knew what the cost of code was, we would figure out the cost of all the different things we could do, and we would write the most cost-effective one. Like if we could figure that out, if we knew, like, are tests really worth it? Is design really worth it? I mean, it's so hard to do that. And so we're left with it. So much of it is subjective, right? Like, I can tell you, I have seen lots of applications, and applications that are designed in this way that need to change. And that's the key point here, right? Code that is put together like this, when it needs to change, is cheaper and more flexible over the life of your application. And that is just like, so how do you sell that? Because I have no evidence. So that's where you have to build trust. Like, they have to believe. Like, here's the thing: you're stewards of their money, because nobody knows what you do. Nobody knows whether or not you're doing the right thing as a dev, except you and your peers. And so the bosses are like lambs to the slaughter. They have no clue. Even someone who used to be a technical person that got promoted to management and is gone for a couple of years, they have no idea. And they are susceptible in all human ways to all human foibles, right? They're susceptible to believe in the people they like the best. They're susceptible to believe in the people who look like them. And so the only thing, like, there's no way to win without trust, and trust is pretty ephemeral. What it means is they feel like you're in. It's so funny, because now I didn't really know where I was going to talk about agile so much, but it really is about the whole. Like, I wrote, okay, now I've started 3 thoughts and not finished any of them. I'm old enough. Like, I started writing code in 1981. Right? I punched cards, and so I wrote. I had decades of waterfall. Like, I worked for Sperry Univac when we would spend a year specking out turnkey systems, and then we would write that code. And it was a horrible experience. Everyone hated it, because, you know, the big contracts that do lots of specifications are just a way to try to prevent yourself from being the one who gets blamed when it fails. That's what those contracts are about. That's what they're about, right? The devs can say, I wrote it like the spec said, you know, I'm not, and we refuse to make any, you know, like, you can't make adjustments over the life of a contract and do what you've figured out needs to be done if you're doing waterfall, because you'll be late and you'll get blamed. There's some penalty in the contract for that. And so if you have, if you're in the boat with them, if they can see your goodwill every day, if they can trust you to have the business interests, not your personal interests, at heart, then they will trust you to make decisions for them. And they're gonna just picking someone to trust. Like, don't imagine anything else is true. They don't have any data. And as far as I know, there is no good data that will let bosses decide on what action plan to follow, when they write code. Like, look for the research. Like, graduate students do research sometimes, but I find all of the research I've ever read very unconvincing. It's like they took 10 graduate students that had 6 months of programming experience and they tried to do them to do thing X and they measured it. It's like they're not real. And so for you, so what I would tell you is you have enormous amounts of power, and you have to exercise lots of judgment for the people who are spending the money, because they don't know if you're doing the right thing or not. And what that means, okay, so all of it is a prelude for me having a one more piece of advice, and that is like, okay, you can't take a big app and say, we're going to close the doors for 6 months or a year and rewrite the whole thing. That's never going to happen. It doesn't work. I've been a part of a few of those. Most of them fail. So what does that mean? And also, so that's a truth, right? Here's another truth. If your business has survived for 5 years, your app is a mess. It's just a fact, right? Those first few years, it's scrambling and craziness and spaghetti, and then all the founders leave and new people comes in, and so you get in this point, right, where no one really understands the code, and so the people are just scrambling around, and people want new features. If you've succeeded, they want new features and change, and you're just going crazy trying to catch up with it. And so it might feel like you never have time to make improvements, but what they need you to do is to build into every estimate a 5 or 10% chunk of time to help improve the code. And here's what I would tell you. Okay, so now I've spent the whole time talking about trust. Here's the thing I want you to do, though. Believe that they trust you to do this and just do it. You should not be asking permission to build the 5 or 10% improvement into your time estimates. You have to do that for them, because they cannot decide for themselves. And so so now what we're talking about is a situation where every time you touch code, you make it a little better. The whole team is supporting each other and doing good things, where you're willing to throw crap over the wall to get a feature out today if the business needs it. But the bosses understand you when you tell them that it's crap and you're going to have to fix it, and that you're all sort of in the same boat, rowing in the same direction. So, okay, so the short version of that is refactoring. Like, refactoring isn't a big thing. Cleaning up isn't a big thing. It's on keyboard, and you do it constantly. And it is not a thing that it's not separate from programming. You don't ask permission as if it's a separate task. It's part of your day-to-day life, and it's a small fraction of every ticket you take off the. Okay, I get that this meeting is being recorded. Anyway, so okay, that only happened because I got too excited. All right, so I'm done here. I'm stopping.
Very interesting.
I was going to follow up on the thing about quantifying like the benefits of agile development. And I think one of the big things, when we talk about trying to convince stakeholders that this is a good idea, or even if someone's kind of on board, is making sure that they're level set on what the benefits are, right? So it's not that you're going to be a more productive team necessarily, especially not right away. A team that's new to Agile is generally going to take a couple of months to really form and storm and get into flow. But it's something that you kind of mentioned very briefly there, Sandi, but like building the right thing is the benefit, right?
Yeah, that's what I was writing down. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. And that's and so if I think, when I talk to stakeholders, I really try to level set for like, this is what we're doing. And I've seen it, and it's come out in projects where we started with one target and we delivered value every week. We demoed it to the stakeholders. We did all the agile things. And then when around, Q1 starts and all of a sudden everything changes at the organization and all the priorities are 100% different from when we started this project, we can say like, oh, well, actually, sure, we can move this to target the new platform. All the code that we wrote is loosely coupled. That we were targeting MongoDB before, but we have data access objects. We have all these things that make it really easy to reuse what we did when we were targeting the wrong thing initially, and get it there later. So how do you quantify that? I'm not sure. Just I think experience is one big part of it, but
I mean, it would help if you had a bunch of people that had lived under waterfall project development, because Agile makes its own extremely convincing case for those folks where they're used to like getting a product every 6 months. And, you know, that when you have those long development cycles, what happens is they don't get what they want and they feel like they have to interrupt you to get things, which means you're always thrashing, which means you're always missing deadlines, which makes them trust you less. Like it's a vicious cycle if you can't deliver quickly. But then if you can, if they know that in 2 weeks at the end of the sprint, they're going to be able to ask you to change your mind, they're going to be able to change their mind and get you to do something else, they leave you alone. So my experience with moving from waterfall to Agile was that we were way more productive right away and everybody was less stressed. Like management was way happier because they knew that if they wanted us to do something different, they could tell us in 2 weeks and that we would jump right on it. And we weren't always like, it just made us together. I mean, I love that metaphor. Everybody was bailing. They weren't sitting back in the boat saying, well, you're sinking now, aren't you? Right. All right. And it was really great. It improved relationships dramatically and pretty much instantly.
That
But
seems
I
like
don't know what, I'm sorry, though, I'll just say one last thing. Like, I don't know how you convince someone who hasn't been through that other process. Like if it's a new startup and there's, you have people, non-technical people who want features and who are at the top. For them, if you're trying to use Agile, what you're saying is, we don't know when it will done. And this is what you're effectively telling them as developers, right? We don't know when it's going to get done and we don't know what it will cost and we don't know what we're giving you. Like, that's a very tough sell.
I just wanted to echo the trust thing and just really, shine a light on that. It seems like, I think you used the word ephemeral, and it's, if you're in the wrong environment where you can't achieve that, I guess it's just the wrong environment.
Richard, we have actually a question from the chat that I think is related. Let me know if you're ready for that.
I do want to add something.
Yes, Li-Hsuan, add something, and then we'll go to that next question. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll actually maybe start answering that. The first question I see too, it might be related. So as a consultant, I've been brought in so I work as an agile coach for a few years. So that means that I probably waste a lot of people's money. And while I hope none of you are my clients, but anyway, so I think agile coach means a lot of different things to different people. So sometimes I'm brought in to get embedded into a team and show them how to do TDD and pair programming. Sometimes I'm brought in to introduce Scrum, like how to manage projects. And sometimes I'm brought in to work with executives on their reorg plans, like how do we structure our organization differently. And so most of those times, people usually bring them in for one or the other. So it's usually about one aspect of that. So it's either about training the people, or changing the process, or improving the systems and tools. But it's rarely that it happens on all three fronts at the same time. And so to me, it seems like a lot of this sort of like cultural change or agile transformation, whatever you want to call it, project failed because usually we are only focusing on one aspect at a time. Like if you just have people training on TDD and pair programming and all that good technical skills, that's still not enough, because if you can change the way that we manage projects, we manage budgets, if we can change the way that how HRS runs, how we hire people, ultimately it is still a waste. That's not enough. So the other question that I want to start answering, and I'm can't wait to hear other people's feedback as well, or their answers as well, is how do you identify an organization to work for from the outside? What I would say is, don't just look at one aspect, right? Don't just look at a team that's really good at pair programming. That's not enough, right? You have to see that what's their business, like how is their business run, what's their process, what does their HR people look like? Do they hire? Do they have a good process for hiring good people? You have to take all that into consideration.
Yes.
Yeah, just to repeat, the question was from Jean, and that was from the panelists. How do you identify an organization to work for from the outside? So you're trying to get hired somewhere, and how do you identify that extends the trust we're talking about and cares about quality of code?
Yeah, it's not easy because most people, at least especially hiring managers, know the right things to say. And so, I used to always look out for, I'm realizing now I'm not a really good person to ask this because I haven't been hireable for over 7 years, but it used to be. And, and people would say things like, I would say, okay, well, do you practice test-driven development? It's like, yeah, well, yes, we're interested in that, or yes, we're exploring that. And like, that's kind of like an immediate no for me, because that's a value of mine. It doesn't have to be your value, but it's, it's mine. And, when do you pair? And I'm not somebody who believes that everybody needs to be pairing 100% of the time, but I do want to be with people that understand that it can be useful sometimes. And I think the best way, and this is the advice I used to give to people like, my siblings that have gotten into tech and some other folks is, just make sure you get in the door and you're able to actually work with some people. Some pairing interviews, some interviews, actually have pairing, or they actually have, conversations or meetings with the team, or you can kind of drop in and you can see a stand up and you can see how the company works. And I think those are much more valuable than the very much like the kind of more exterior, like we just ask you questions if you're a good fit. I think good companies, good hiring practices would require that they understand that you're also making a tough decision, and they want you to make the right decision and figure out what's best for you. That's what I think, and I think the right companies don't shy away from that. They embrace it. They let you come and check it out.
I think a particularly challenging thing is that a lot of companies will make you do like a 3-hour take-home assignment and a phone screen and all this stuff before you get a chance to ask these questions in the first place. So it's really good to, get on LinkedIn, find people who are working there, to go through your network to find places. I think like some of the questions that I ask people when I'm interviewing would be things like, how do you translate your high-level vision to the day-to-day work? And if they don't have a very good answer for that, they probably don't have the processes in place that are going to help them have that kind of trust that we're looking for here. So I think that's like my number one question that I go to. That tells me a lot more than just about trust, obviously. But I think if someone's practicing Agile, they ought to have a good answer for that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would add, don't be afraid to ask for what you want, because Justin made a good point that sometimes, and I sit in different seats in the organization, but lately I've been doing a lot of work on the recruiting end on our side, and the hiring process and at Def Method, and it's true. Like we may subject a candidate to a code test first, or to some series of questions first, and that can be off-putting. But there's never been a time that somebody has said, hey, do you want to can someone just like get on the phone with me for 20 minutes and talk about this company? And we would absolutely do it. But it's easy to put blinders on and just say, no, this is the way we march everybody through. So I think that's a good point, Justin.
Sorry, I missed half that because my power went out for a minute, but I am back. So I hope it was super interesting.
We just circled back to dogs, talking about
good
half-mile times for dogs.
Good.
Yes, Sandy, the question was, how do you identify an organization from the outside that follows good methods and you can trust them that they have actually good code practices?
Yeah, okay. Look, the only thing who knows, stop me if somebody already said this. If you can find someone that looks like you in that organization who has a job like you'll have, and you can take them out for coffee, that's a great way to find something else. The other thing is if you can get a look at, if they'll share the code with you, if they'll let you look at their GitHub repos, that you can tell a lot. Like look at the recent commits and see what people are doing. because you can tell, like, are they pairing? Are there tests? Like a lot of, I mean, I don't know what the other folks said. It's easy to imagine someone said, organizations say claim that they are agile, but they are not. Right. And so that's like everybody wants to be agile. Nobody says, oh, no, we're not agile. Just like everybody wants to say, oh, we're pairing. Yes, we do TDD. But, you know what, I mean, my experience, well, one last thing. Like you can almost break the agile principles. You can look at the agile manifesto and take the principles and you can break them down into two categories of things. There's a category that's about process, like software development, like putting everybody in the same room, like that. There's a whole category of things like having sprints, delivering continuous delivery, right? And then there's another set of principles that are really about how programmers behave. You ought to write tests, you ought to do pairing. And what I find is it's really common for organization, and those, if you break them down along those dividing lines, the ones that are about process really are of benefit to the organization. Like, we're going to give you software faster. You're going to be able to make changes all the time, blah, blah, blah. The ones that are about how programmers behave, the bosses often perceive as increasing costs. Why should we pair? We're only going to get half as much done. Why should we write tests? That is just wasted code. And so if you find an organization that says they're agile, but they only do the part that benefits management, they're not really agile, and it's going to roll downhill onto you. And so it's important to know, like, can I pair? Are there tests? Those two things. If you're not agile, if you're not doing that. And the other stuff's really important. I'm not saying it's not, but it all has to happen. You can't just pick and choose and have ones that benefit like one side of the power equation and not the other.
You know, time is evaporating. I could listen to these discussions. And so there's another question here. It's going to change gears for us a little bit. I think Sandy directed.
Sorry, my dog needs out. I'm listening.
This practical object-oriented design replaced 99 bottles, or is it good to read both?
They're really different books. Like Pooter is about, okay, so I wrote Pooter for me as a younger programmer because I wished that someone, I keenly remember like going in the OO cave and trying to figure out, well, how do you make it go? Like, how does it start, right? Like procedural code is so natural and OO is not really. And so I wanted to explain everything I had learned about how to think about OO to somebody, to my younger self. But so in that sense, even though I hope it's practical, like it's meant to be about theory, it's about how to think about objects. What happened after that is that people, like it's abstract enough so that it can be hard for, like for people who have a lot of experience, they can read Pooter and say, wow, this is really interesting. For people that don't have a lot of experience, they read chapters 1 through 4 and then they get stuck because there's a jump in the level of abstraction in the book. 99 Bottles is an attempt to remedy that stickness. And so it is a refactoring where every character that gets typed is shown in the book, and there's an explanation given about why that choice was made. And so when people ask me like what order they should do it in, I think of 99 Bottles as being absolutely practical. There are some complaints from more advanced readers. They're like, oh, this was so tedious because you wrote down every line of code. And it's like, well, yes, we did. That was the point. Right. And so I would start people, a newer programmer, I would just give 99 Bottles and say, type it all, like read it and type everything and feel what happens. And then you can read Pooter and sort of get a bigger framework to integrate. Like 99 Bottles is concrete and Pooter is the abstraction above it.
Sandy, I have a theory and I wanted to see if you would confirm it, which is related, which is that one of the reasons that your book took off, and I'm just outside of a lot of things about it just being an outstanding read, was that it had a specific, you may not have intended to target this, but it had this way of addressing people that were coming from statically typed languages. And so many of us were, I was at the time.
Oh, interesting.
A lot of people were coming from that either they're still doing it professionally and they were learning Ruby, or like me, they were lucky enough to have just been like dropped onto a Ruby project coming from, you know, learning Java or coming from .NET or something else. And so, and actually you mentioned chapters 1 through 4, and then in chapter 5, duck typing is like you're talking directly to the me from 2008-ish.
Yeah.
Like, hey, if this is really scary to you because you're coming from a static language, let me tell you a little bit about dynamic languages and why this is powerful and why you don't need to be so scared. And there was a couple of other books before yours that I will remain nameless that I don't think quite hit that mark. And so I don't think they took off in the same way. And I've always thought that that was one of the reasons.
That's super interesting. I had never considered that.
All right. Well,
I mean, duck typing. So think about this. I did dynamically typed OO first. Like mostly I wrote Smalltalk and then I wrote Ruby, and in between them I wrote a little Java. And boy, did I hate that. It was so hard to write. I felt so handicapped in the statically typed OO language, even though I totally understand that there's a level of safety that you get there. If you don't do duck typing well, you can really hurt yourself in dynamic languages. Okay, can I tell you why I think it was popular?
Yeah,
I mean, I certainly didn't expect it to be, right? People kept asking to read parts of it and then no one did, right? Like even my friends wouldn't read it while I was writing it. So it seemed extremely unlikely that anybody would ever actually spend money on the book. While I was writing it, I read, do you guys know Kathy Sierra? Is that a name that's familiar to you? She was a woman, do you know here, hang on a minute. Do you know books like this?
head first stuff, yeah.
Okay, now she didn't write this, but she's head first, right? She's like she and her husband, I think, started it. And so she was someone who had a blog where she wrote a bunch of stuff about how to communicate with humans, was really what was on her blog. And then I don't really have all the details on this, but she started getting harassed online and disappeared. And so she apparently, I'm sort of making this up. So if this is like vague, this is true in intent, right? She had a horse farm. I think they had horses or something. And she and her husband were both technical people, and they decided to write a book, but they really needed it to succeed. And most technical books fail. Like most technical books, you don't pay back their advances. And so I think there's a video of her talking about this, and I watched that video. So what they did was they decided they needed to write a best-selling technical book. And then they had to figure out how to figure out what a best-selling technical, what are the characteristics of a best-selling technical book. And they went and they went on Amazon and they looked at the reviews of technical books. And so they got all the 5-star books, and they did linguistic analysis of the comments to try to figure out what people were saying about books that were selling well. And here was the key difference. The books that got high ratings but did not sell, that had low Amazon ranks but high ratings, the comments said things like, this person must be really smart. And the books that had high ratings and high rankings had comments that said, this book made me feel smart. And my goal on every page of Pooter was to make the reader feel smart. I wanted that sort of generous open-heartedness. I wanted people to think it was just stuff they didn't know, not things they couldn't do. And so because of that, I wanted to explain everything to the younger me, because everything in there was hard for me to learn. Like I'm not educated in the computer science sort of world. And so I had to sort of make things up or figure things out. Like I could have saved myself a lot of trouble had I just known more about the literature, but I didn't. And so I wanted people to have a way that made sense and was respectful to get that information. And duck typing was on that list though. So I'm glad that people coming from statically typed languages found it useful and not off-putting.
That story is awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, I was going to say on that thing about making people feel smart, it really reminded me of like, you know, the Rich Hickey talk, like simple versus easy, right? And I think the book's a really good example of making simple easy, right?
Yeah.
Like you're talking about specifically just tackling the complexity and removing unnecessary complexity. And you talk about some pretty abstract ideas, but you know, hopefully your readers have ridden a bike before. If not, then I think they'll still get the concept, because it's taking something that's complicated enough to be a really good example, but easy enough and just so ubiquitous. We all know what a bike is and basically how it works, that anyone can kind of understand the principles.
Yeah.
And there's one other side. I know you mentioned 99 bottles is a great thing for a beginner. I read it as a mid-level engineer, and I'd say it's a great cure for the Dunning-Kruger effect, because I don't want to go away too much, but the book asks you to solve a code problem, and then you can evaluate your solution. And I think someone who knows enough to be dangerous, but doesn't really get hasn't really quite grokked all the OOP stuff yet, is probably going to come up with a suboptimal solution. And the way you lay it out there is really, I think, powerful to experience as a developer.
It was, I'm deeply grateful to have reached the point in my life where I'm not embarrassed to write simple code. Like, it's so comforting not to have to do complicated things anymore. And complexity draws us. I don't know why. Like, complexity is cool. Hard things are fun, but simple code is better. And it's just nice. Like, I don't feel ashamed of writing simple code anymore. And so it's a grown-up thing, right? There's a curve. You like more complicated, more complicated, more complicated. And then if with any luck, we'll all live long enough to get to the other side of that.
There's a new question on the table about service objects. Service objects which have become popular in Rails land for organization code. There is some that is just, I'm sorry, let me try again. Let me start over. You can read it in the chat. You can, it's a service objects which have become popular in Rails land for organization code.
For organizing.
That is sort of, for organizing, okay, organizing code that is sort of just procedural and doesn't have an obvious place to live. What are your opinions on service objects in general? Are there some smells when organizing code like this?
Well, yeah. Again, I don't want to monopolize everything here, so I would be super interested in hearing what everyone else has to say. So, you know, Rails is great. Rails is great for a small app where the action the user wants maps directly to a row in a database table. Like, that's the active record pattern. None of you have apps like that. I'll bet. Like, as soon as you get in a situation where the thing the user asks for requires the cooperation of a number of different data objects, then you're in trouble. You have other business logic that's not tightly coupled to either one of those things, and you have to put it someplace. All right. And so you need more things than comes naturally hardwired in the How to Do Rails book. And service objects are a popular way. Like, you know, the way I've seen people use them is they had a controller and it, you know, the generator no longer works. They had to put a bunch of stuff in it. They had a controller action that needed to talk to more than one active record object. And so that logic that does the collaboration between those objects has to go someplace. And often they put it in a service object. I think there's a whole bunch of kinds of, okay, like here's an idea, right? I need an object that's unrelated to the GUI that controls the collaboration of two different data objects. That's a kind of thing. You probably have a category of like that where you have more than one of the thing like that. You can call them, at that point, that thing is probably not a service object, but it probably represents sort of a virtual data object, right? That hides the two or three or four active record things behind it. Then it's going to talk, like when the user comes in and they hit enter on their keyboard, when they press the go button, when that request arrives at Rails, they're asking for a procedure. Like, they want the whole thing to run and the output to come back to them. And very often you need an object to stand in for that procedure. Now, it shouldn't have all the logic. It shouldn't do everything, but it should know that I need step A, and then I need step B, and then I need to call this object, and I need to call that object, and I would get all the returns from all of them. It's going to succeed or fail, and I'm going to respond. And so that's a category of thing too, right? The thing that manages the whole procedure that the user wants to. And so service object is a term that is so generic as to almost be meaningless. But what I would say is there's a whole, like I think of all of these things as models. And I don't really like the model folder in Rails. Be very careful about thinking that what goes in model are things that are descendants of active record. Like that's not what a model is. For most of you, where you have grown-up applications that are complicated, your models are some object that represents a business idea, and your own model might have to control the collaboration of a couple of different rows in your database table. One thing I'll tell you is if I spin up a new Rails app, the first thing I do is I go in the model directory and I create an AR subdirectory. And I put everything that's a subclass of active record down there. And that, naming is so powerful. That change alone exerts a bunch of force on your application. It makes people want to make business models to put in the model object. It makes people want to not put business behavior in those subclasses of active record. And both of those pressures are good for your application. So service objects, like call them whatever you want. I'm a big fan of like what I want to do. Like, okay, I'm going to step back. So Justin has probably heard this question. I don't know if anybody else has ever been in one of my classes. Let me ask you all, are you going to be using Rails 5 years from now? Maybe. Are you going to be using Rails 10 years from now? Are you going to be using Rails 15 years from now? Like I am so old that frameworks come and go like window shades going up and down. And what you're going to find is someday you're going to want to port your business logic to some other framework. And you should start right now. Like we love Rails. I have nothing bad to say about Rails, but it is not my business. And you need to start right now getting your business logic out of the Rails framework. And that means that what you want to do is treat active record and the controllers like hot potatoes. You don't want to put business logic in where you want to jump from those things into your own code as quickly as possible. So I want my controller to call some object that's mine that gets past a list of parameters, maybe not the params hash, but maybe. But I'm not gonna treat it like it's a Rails thing. Like it's gonna tell me all the data that came from the user, and then I'm gonna do something and return something that it can use to render in the output. Like I want to get away from the edges of the framework and I'm going to drive the edges of the framework apart and put my code in the middle. And that means later when I like it's a commodity, unwrapping the HTTP request, getting a session, all that stuff. Like you can get that anywhere. Like persisting a bunch of data to a database, having it go and get stored there, having it come back when you read it, that's a commodity. You can get it anywhere. Like frameworks are a dime a dozen and they're going to change. Like I have worked on an application where the data persisted through many cycles of different languages and frameworks. They went from Smalltalk to Java to Ruby. And we had to port the apps over and over again over a period of like, okay, I'm old, 15 or 20 years. And whether or not you're the one that does it, somebody is going to do it to your app if that business succeeds. And so I'm like, yeah, make some service objects. And I don't care what you call them. Like name the category and make a folder for it and put them in there. Like make sure that people who read your code can tell what it means. But make a bunch of models. You should be making lots more modelish kind of objects than you're probably doing. Okay, see, I got on my high horse again. Sorry. Animate.
We have another question, and just to kind of give everyone a sanity check, we have about 18 minutes left, schedule time. And the question is, what are your thoughts on domain-driven design in Rails?
Domain-driven design in general, I think is brilliant. It's like in the abstract, the ideas of domain-driven design fit nicely into Rails. In the concrete, like if you want to start, like I have tried, let me say this, I have tried to implement I have written some domain-driven design-ish frameworky things like entities and those kind of objects to wrap database stuff. And it doesn't fit very well into Rails. It's hard to do. And it's one of those, like, there are a number of people who've written frameworks to put, other kind of frameworks that go in Rails that help you. You can think of it this way. They're like pre-designed. They help you structure and organize your code. And many of them don't survive the test of time. And it makes me uncomfortable. I feel very cautious about using anybody else's framework on top of Rails because it adds levels of complexity to code. Like here's the thing, I don't want to depend on code that I didn't write. And if I needed it and it was too complicated for me to write, I would use it. But nothing like you are all smart enough to do a better job of organizing your code in Rails. And I don't think it's necessary to invest in using other frameworks that add kinds of complexity that you don't necessarily understand and that you're not certain are going to be maintained. Like do this, right? Every time you touch a method in a controller, if that method doesn't look like the generator, create an object and slam all that code into it and call it. And do that for a while until you find that there's some change that they ask for and you keep having to touch a couple of places. Like in the end, you're going to find objects are going to appear if you just give them an opportunity and take your code out of Rails. Don't use callbacks in active record. Put your callback in a piece of code that owns the active record object. Like put your class in front and call the active record thing and then call your callback. You have to do your own transaction management if you do that, but that's the only downside. And so all of these things are ways to get your business code back under your control. Like don't use helpers. Write your own presenter objects. Like there's stuff that Rails does for you that is really, really handy that you don't want to have to do, but you don't want the logical control of the operations of your apps to be hidden behind Rails because you cannot port it. You're not in control of it and you can't port it to another app.
I had a question for you about that.
Yeah.
Would you extend that to things like dry-RB and those libraries that, I think there's some benefits there that they kind of encourage good things like dependency injection.
I do like that.
Okay.
I do like it, right? Like I would be cautious about using it. Like as long as it's easy to roll your own, I would just it's possible that it will save you money, and if it does, you should use it. But I would make sure I understood that code. I don't think that's going away, but I would make sure I could maintain that code myself and then I understood how it worked. How many ports have you done? How many gems have gone out of, right? Like I really want to minimize the number of external dependencies I have. And it's because I've lived too long, right? Many things that worked under 0.13 when I first started writing Rails apps broke badly in later releases. And like, I don't know, I want you to be trusting and trustworthy, but I would just not, I want to minimize the number of dependencies I have. I'll just put it that way.
So what you're saying is depend on things that are not that likely to change. Is that
Yeah. like, I mean, Ruby is the 900-pound gorilla. You can depend on it, right? Rails is pretty dependable these days. You go downhill rapidly from there. I mean, if you find yourself needing patterns over and over again, like here's the thing about dynamic languages like Ruby, they're so easy to write. Like if you find yourself doing repeatedly writing the same sort of boilerplate to support your own code, it's possible that either it's in dry-RB, you're going to find it there, or that with just a little bit of simple locally maintained code, you can do it yourself. And I would pay attention to whether or not I could support it locally. Like here's what I'm looking for: not magic. I'm looking for not magic. And dynamic languages are great because you can do magic in them. Sometimes you need magic and it's very difficult, if what you need is magic, only magic will do. But lots of times, just like complexity, magic is appealing. Like we use magic in times when maybe we should be a little less magical.
Does anyone else want to weigh in on this idea about domain-driven development?
Well, I hear domain-driven development, and then there's a there's like a memory in the back of my head from this this guy Ariel that I used to work with, who's a fantastic developer, and he used to just say, "We are trying to establish a ubiquitous language." And that's like the big thing that everybody takes out of that. But it is kind of it is important. Like the biggest thing that I took a course a million years ago with Eric Evans, and I loved it, but I think the thing that I got out of it the most was, and this kind of goes back to the first question that we talked about, is that it aligns, it gets developers talking about the business, which makes it easier to talk to the business about the business. And if you can also get the business to start using some of the terms that you are using, well, then that communication piece that I talked about becomes a whole lot easier. And you say, hey, look, I'm working on the Bing Zam Whopper object, and and we need to spend some time to get it connected to this other object, and they know kind of what you're talking about. Then it becomes less mysterious to the business. Doesn't take away any of the things that Sandy said. Like, yes, it's still going to be hard to predict. Yes, they're still not going to know. They're not going to be able to put a dollar amount on it. But if they know what you're talking about, then you can talk. And it doesn't come naturally. I don't think, as a developer turned business owner, it does not come naturally for me to think about things from a business perspective. It usually comes naturally to me to think about things from a software and design perspective. And this like dirty little secret about being in the service industry is like I can abstract myself out of deadlines because they're always somebody else's deadlines, not mine. But in a real way, we want to get invested in client success, and so we need to be able to have this conversation. So to the extent that domain-driven design can get you oriented around the actual business and orient your application around the problem space of the business, it will serve you well.
Yeah, I've read about DDD, and I've even done a few event storming workshops, but I've yet to work at a place that really properly everyone's bought in. Like earlier, we were talking about getting stakeholders bought into agile. Doing that with DDD is saying like, oh, also not everyone needs to read the Eric Evans book, but it's a big ask, right? Most engineers don't even want to read that much of a dry text.
There's better versions.
Yeah,
DDD, right?
DDD Distilled is a really good book, of course. There's some challenges there, but I think when you think about what the alleged benefits are, right, or just some things that are just ring very true, like one of the concepts is that like on a service, one team should be working in any given service. If you've ever worked on a project where you have multiple teams working in the same repositories, especially if there's multiple repositories that multiple teams are touching, it gets really hard to maintain those high code standards that we're talking about here because different teams just have different norms and the communication overhead gets really high. So, DDD asks a lot from my perspective, but everything that I read about, I'm like, yes, this makes sense. This is the way to build software as far as I can tell.
There's another question in the.
Sorry, just because Li-Hsuan also unmuted, so I want to make sure that he gets a turn.
I appreciate that.
Oh, sorry.
I was just gonna echo like everything everybody else has said. I think DDD really applies to outside of writing code as well. Like I think as a developer, a lot of times we have a tendency to jump straight into solution and jump into writing code. But more often than not, I think the real problems are usually on the domain, on the business side. So to really understand the business is really a first step of starting all of our projects. You think about the not just in terms of like how do I build this feature or roll out this product, but also like how do we organize our teams? How do we structure our business? So I think, sometimes that we just need to like be able to really stay on a problem space a little bit longer. That's it. Thank you.
I'm trying to find this question that was in the chat here. I think it was panelists. Are there any good examples in the open source that separate business logic from Rails? I'm not 100% sure I understand this question entirely. I guess the intent here is just a good canonical sort of example of how to write code in the open source world? Is that what we're asking? I'm not sure who initially asked this question. Anybody want to
I don't have
clarify
one.
the question or jump on the answer?
If I understand the question correctly, someone said, I mean, what people want is an example of a Rails app that's well organized, that uses the principles that we're talking about today. And everyone I don't know of any. They're all behind firewalls. All the ones I know of that are pleasing, you can't look at. Sorry, Joe.
So
New book?
I joined this construction startup a while ago, and I started learning more about construction business. And the one thing I realized is that in construction is a lot like building software.
Yeah.
So if you think about like building houses and building like bridges, no one project is alike. Like everything, every time you build out a new house or new towers or whatever, it's always a little bit different. And so in that sense, I don't think that there's gonna be like a golden example of Rails projects, because that when we build software, every time we build a large sufficient enough software, it's going to be one of a kind. It's going to be something very special for the problem you are solving.
It's been a couple of years since I tooled around with the code base, but people have long championed discourse, and probably not the discourse that you're thinking of, but this discourse open source project that really is just a thing that helps you to create mailing lists, discussion forums, things like that. And so it's it's there. I don't know if it is a great example of separating business logic from the Rails, but it is an example of a very mature code base that you can look at, and it's used pretty widely, and it's been contributed to by many people. And short of anything that I could actually full-throatedly recommend, I could at least say, well, you could check that out. You could see how people are actually doing it in the wild, and you could see kind of an application, warts and all.
I mean, if you're super interested, Code Climate, all the open source projects have Code Climate scores. So you could go crawling around and see if you could find a project that had a high score and see what it looked like.
I'm sorry, what is that score? Can you repeat that, please? I'm sorry.
Oh, do you guys know Code Climate?
Code Climate. It's new to me, but it may not be to anyone else.
It's a kind of software. It's an application that you can get a subscription to that will monitor the code quality of your application. So it does static analysis of the source code and gives you scores along a bunch of different dimensions. And they do open source projects for free. And so if you go look at open source projects, sometimes they link to their Code Climates.
Oh, that's really cool.
Yeah. And there's a bunch of, it's fun to look at that stuff anyway. There's a bunch of interesting metrics. Like it's going to make you want to run Code Climate on your own apps. That's all. If you don't have Code Climate, you're going to want that. You're going to want that data.
Yeah.
Would that be your choice of a go-to to try to get some metrics?
It would probably be where I would start. There's another one that I cannot, whose name might come to me.
Well, if you go to the Seattle RD folks, they seem
okay, good.
Oh, you've mentioned Flog before. I don't know if you would call that in the same category or.
I mean, I think Code Climate probably uses Flog. They use Flog and Flay and Reek and all those things or things like that. They started there, sort of under the table.
It's true. Yeah, they started by kind of uniting all of those services, and then they built out some of their own.
Yeah, for those of you, like if some of you haven't done metrics, if you just Google like Ruby and metrics, you'll find things that basically what they are is they're programs that look at your source code and count things and give them scores. And so they try to, we were talking before how you can't really, like we don't have a good way to say, oh, it really will save you money if you write software my way. Like I have no good way to prove that. And metrics are not infallible, but they at least are reproducible. and having metric, they can be very interesting. Like you should get some metrics on your code if you have not done so. Go download some of those programs and have a look.
It's one of the things that often like just matches what you'd expect, right? I had a legacy project I was working on, and we were kind of going through some complexity estimations for tackling certain older areas of the code base, and I ran Flog, and it was very much in line with all the other things you would expect, like all the controllers or models that we knew were going to be problems got the highest Flog scores. So it's kind of, if that was for someone who's very familiar with the code base, but I think it's a great tool if you're not that familiar with the code base to kind of like turn over some stones. Where do I need to look here? What's going on?
Yeah. I mean, if you don't know the code base, again, if you're thinking about going to work someplace and you can get a hold of the code, like looking at the metrics will tell you where the dragons are. Like, is there one dragon? Like, is user 10,000 lines long, right? Or is the complexity sort of evenly spread out over the app? Like that, that's really useful information. If there's a couple, if there's a few really huge files that are really complicated, it's a sign that they're not really doing OO. If all the files are small and the complexity is spread out, I don't know, maybe it's better. Like, be worth looking more closely at some of that code.
Because he's on this call and he's done some awesome work, I'm going to call out Steve Bruds, who I just posted the link to the GitHub project Accelerate Metrics.
Oh, CodeScene, that was what I was thinking of, Joe.
Oh, it was? Okay.
Yeah,
cool.
yeah. CodeScene is so cool.
Yeah. And so, so this, like, it's a layer of abstraction probably removed from like, hey, is this code, it's not cyclomatic complexity. It's more about, hey, how much time does it take us to deploy? When we fail, how quickly can we restore, and get back on track, which also, if the organization you're thinking about joining is open to, even talks about these metrics, that's a really great sign. If they're open to talk about how they're doing and how they've trended over time, that's even better.
Yeah. And the parts of CodeScene that I find really fascinating are the graphs that tell you, they give you your bus factor basically, right? They say who works on the code, like they draw a bunch of circles and they tell you like this code is only ever touched by this person and it gets changed this often and it's this complicated. Like you can draw a bunch of conclusions about how organizations are put together and communicate by looking at the patterns of programmers touching code. And they give you visualizations of that in CodeScene. You don't have to just like crawl around in the repos and look at who did the commits. It's super interesting. CodeScene has a page where they have all their open source projects linked to, so you can go to CodeScene and go look at the examples or the demos and crawl around in some big projects. It's really interesting.
Yeah, this looks fascinating. I'm a recovering Java programmer. My context is a couple of years into the Ruby Rails space. So I'm only familiar with some of the things you guys mentioned, like Flog, Ruby Critic and stuff like that. I know we're sort of run out of time, and I'm going to be selfish and ask a question because I don't see any other ones out here. And this is going to sound like, well, actually, there's one. So I'm going to just insert my question really quick. Maybe you can think on it and include it and answer. One of the things that's curious to me is like, how do you know enough? And I know that's a kind of a vague thing, but it's like, I love the work that you've done in the literature, Sandi and Joe, and sometimes it just feels endless. It's like there's a place where you're trying to get to this nirvana of complete understanding. I don't know. I maybe that's an easy question for you guys, but while you're thinking about that, I'm going to call out this question that somebody's written here. We have a data-heavy Rails application, and our unit tests often involve a bunch of complicated mocks and stubs around active record scopes. This makes the test very brittle and of limited use when refactoring. Any ideas for improving unit tests of an application that's heavy on database interaction?
Yes. Sorry. Okay, remember that part where I was talking about being tightly coupled to the Rails framework? Right? When you put your business logic in a subclass of active record, you are tightly coupled to that entire chain of operations that jumps from this Ruby code to the adapters, to to the driver, across the wire, maybe to do IO to the database and backup. Like that is not a unit test. And you're tightly coupled to a distant, slow running operation that you do not own when you put your business logic in code that's not yours. And what you find is you can't decouple it, which is why you have to mock and stub. Like think about like what would the code look like if you could test it? What would have to be true about the code? If you had all of your business logic in an object that you owned, in a model object that was yours, and you plugged into that, you injected into that the database object, the subclass of active record, then you could test your business object by creating a thing that conformed to the same API as your business object and plugging something else in. All right. And you don't have to, if you use dependency injection, if you create your own models and you use dependency injection, that's how you get decoupling. And if you decouple your code in that way, you don't need mocks or stubs. I have gotten to the point where I believe that the need to mock and stub, the need to mock or stub is the design flaw. It's a sign of a design flaw in code. If you decouple stuff and you're using dependency injection and you own your own code, you don't need mocks and stubs. Like mocks and stubs are necessary, but they're so we can break into tightly coupled legacy code and test it. If you're writing new code, you ought to be able to write your own business object, plug the active record thing in, and then you can make a dummy to stand in for the active record object and plug that in and do all your business object testing. And that will work. I've seen it done. That is, I'm not just making this up in a wild theory. Like you can just do that. Agree, same. Yeah, I mean, so here's the thing. This is what happens when you do that, right? You have to stop thinking of the objects that you're interacting with as being a kind of the thing that they are. They're a kind of the role that they play. And you don't know what they are and you don't care. Just don't worry your pretty little head. It's like a thing that acts like a database thing. And then all my business logic has nothing to do with the database. Like who cares about persistence? Persistence just works. It's a commodity. You can get it anywhere. What makes you special, and the part, like you don't need to test that active record does a save. Like they test that. If you don't think that works, you shouldn't be using Rails. Like what you want is to test the code you wrote, your own business logic. And you just need to be able to plug in the databasey parts, like get separate from that. Like if you, anyway, so clear, right? Like if you get your business logic in your own objects and you inject the parts that are tightly coupled to the framework, you can test your own stuff and the tests run fast. And you should start looking for opportunities to do that. Like I would tell you, every time you touch an active record object, if you have to change some business logic that's in it, you should take that as an opportunity to make a bigger object on the outside that's a business object that gets an instance of that active record object, even if it gets it itself. Like you can inject it in the initializer by newing it up right there. All right. Anyway, sorry, Justin, what did I interrupt you?
I was going to say like, yeah, I think one.
Sorry, I'm listening.
Oh, yeah. One potential way to think about that, because we were talking about tests in the question, is like, how would you test this in mini test? If you weren't using RSpec, which you probably are, and you didn't get to say, allow whatever class to receive this and return that, and then you have like 20 of those in your before clause, and that's the kind of thing like using dependency injection, like you say, right? So I really like using these simpler testing capabilities there. When at one point I worked on a Python project after having only done Ruby, and I was like, well, how do you do this kind of magic stuff that we did in RSpec in Python? And the answer is you don't.
Yeah, you don't.
And that's a good thing.
You don't need it.
Yeah.
Like write code so that you don't need it. If you
Yep.
need a stub in a stub, you've made a mistake. Right.
So I just posted this video you did at RailsConf, Sandi, 2016. Get a whiff of this. And in there's a I think that's the right video. And correct me if I'm wrong. Where you deal with the violation of the law of Demeter, and you kind of reach out and talk about this it's like a concrete example. It's kind of cool. I don't know if that would be helpful to the person posting this question, but basically she makes the point again about you don't need to test active record. and, you know,
Oh
structuring,
yeah. Okay. I do remember
structuring,
now.
structuring the code so you can basically, you know, just put your own object in and get like an instant test, you know, just, you know, it just returns some value. I'm not sure if that's in line with what you were trying to share with us moments ago, Sandy, or not.
Yeah, I mean, kind of. Like, here's the thing. Again, I don't want you to feel like I'm hating on Rails because I'm not. I love Rails, right? That's why I get to write Ruby. Like, it really changed the world for all of us. And I know that there are famous people in the Rails community who want you to use all of their little helper things that they put into Rails. They want you to use Rails helpers. They want you to use callbacks. And those things work as long as your app is simple. But if you, they probably are hurting all of you. Like, you wouldn't be in this call if you weren't working for a business that was using Ruby or Rails that was somewhat that had survived, that had won in the marketplace and survived for a number of years, which to me means you have a lot of code and it's probably a mess. And so, and you shouldn't feel bad about that. That's what success looks like in the world. But you don't have to keep on making bad decisions. Like you can do better. And part of that is to like stop, like look for ways to decouple your code from the framework and notice like that's a canary in the coal mine. If you're using a lot of mocks and stubs in your tests, you're tightly coupled to slow running operations that you can't easily get decoupled from. You should think of, you just ask yourself the question, how would the code look if this were easy to test? Because the code probably does need to look that way. And the answer to almost every question about how it would look is that you would be injecting your dependencies. That's what gets you decoupled from distant operations.
But you would be injecting a stub or a mock in that case, right? I just want to get on the same
inject a
page
stub
with
or
you.
mock. I would make a plain old Ruby object that had the methods in it that my active record object had. And don't tell me there's like 9,000 of them. You can't do it. Believe me, you're not using them all, or you don't need them
Right.
all in the test, right? I would just make so here's the thing. If you mock stub, in that case, if you create a mocker stub and inject it, you have to create that same mocker stub in every test that you might need that object in. If you create a plain old, if you're using dependency injection and you can just make another object that conforms to the same API, make a duck type, you can use that duck type everywhere in any test. It dramatically decreases the amount of code and the amount of complexity in your test. Like, I don't need magic. I just need dependency injection. And to use dependency injection, you have to embrace the idea that you do not know what kind of thing that other object is. Walks like a duck, it quacks like a duck. I send it messages, it works. I don't care what it is.
Right on.
All right, I know we got to go. How do you know when you know enough? Can I address that?
Oh, please. Yeah, I would love to hear.
You just quit caring. You just quit caring. You'll never know enough. Somebody mentioned Dunning-Kruger a while ago. Like the more I learn, the more it becomes clear to me the vast number of things I don't know. Like the number of things that I don't know keeps growing every day. And I just don't feel so bad about it anymore. Like, don't worry. It's just yesterday's news. Lots of stuff you don't need to learn because it'll be gone tomorrow. Like if you learn if you learn like how to think about code and how to be easy on yourself, and you keep on doing learning, like following your curiosity to learn new things about programming, that's really all you need to do. Don't worry about anything else. You'll be fine.
Yeah, I have to agree. And I think there's such a tendency among people that I know professionally to, and personally for that matter, to kind of beat themselves up for not knowing something or for doing something wrong. And I was one of those people for a long time. And it's nice to be just a little bit older and feel like I may have achieved some serenity just by letting go of those things.
Whatever.
I like to say that I spent most of my 30s realizing that I didn't know as much as I thought I knew in my 20s. And, and that's kind of true. But then at the end of it, I kind of was like, well, now I know some things and there's a whole bunch of things I don't know, and that's fine. I will also say that if you are open to what you know and what you don't know, you are you are being vulnerable, and by being vulnerable, you can learn things by showing an amount of humility and not pretending that you know something, or just kind of glazing over something that you don't know, but just saying, well, I don't know this, can you explain it to me? You'll learn a tremendous amount. And most of the time, people will be really receptive to that.
Love the good idea, even if it's not yours.
I like that.
What Joe was saying, it sounds a lot like beginner mind, right? If anyone's familiar with that concept, it's kind of being open-minded to and aware of that you just don't know everything, and that makes you open to all these solutions that you might not otherwise see, because you're in a very preset path, like you're an expert. You have this expert mind, and you know the exact tool to need to go to, which certainly is handy when you are an expert in something. But I think the beginner mind, the idea is that when you first are addressed with it, you don't immediately go to that. You really try to take in what's going on here. What are some solutions? And if you come up with a solution, think about the next solution, the one after that. And you'll find yourself leading yourself to learn lots of things when you do that.
I like that. I know we're over time. I'm just going to throw a question out there, and you guys can say, hey, we don't have time for this, but in kind of keeping with all the things you guys are talking about, like, what do you think of the whole no code movement? Because in its ideal execution, you know, someone who really doesn't know much of anything about what we're talking about could potentially produce a product. You think that's going to happen? Do you think that's real? Do you like that, hate that? Panel, I would love to just, I don't know, you know, maybe a couple of cents on that.
I'm too old. I've seen a bunch of those come and go, and none of them ever worked. So I'm not worried about my job yet.
Someone at Stride did a thing where they were trying to specifically focus on no code stuff for clients, and they learned a lot from the project. Stride is not doing that as a service offering. What they learned is that generally the customers always want some kind of functionality that's not covered in this off-the-shelf software.
You can do 90% of it.
Yeah, so the customers are always going to want more. It's a really hard thing to sell.
I think that based on my understanding of it, Salesforce makes some of the best no-code solutions around, and they have an enormous multi-million, probably multi-billion-dollar market in just implementing Salesforce. So that kind of tells you, I think, what you need to know about what no-code really offers. It probably offers a lot of us chances to work.
Jobs,
yeah.
Yeah, like I hope the no-code movement really happens, so then we can all quit our jobs and go into politics and start fixing the real system.
Yeah.
Oh, there you go.
I love that. All right. I think it would be very interesting to see what happens in no-code solutions, you know, in the AI world, you know, 10 years from now or something like that, when you can know very little and create some kind of semi-intelligent, you know, sentient robot. But I don't know, I guess that's a long ways off. I know we're over time. It's just been wonderful hearing you guys share, and really enjoyed it. I don't know if we want to keep going or not, or if we're
I
gonna.
gotta go. You'll have to go without me. My dinner's getting cold.
Thank you so much, Sandy. It's been really, really wonderful.
It was a treat. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you
It was
for
a
coming by.
pleasure. Thanks for listening to the rant.
Thank you.
Rant. All right.
Thank you, Sandy.
Be well. Be safe. All right. Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
So thank you so much, panel. It's been really awesome. I'm not sure if Justin dropped off or not, but Li-Hsuan, Joe.
Still here.
He's here.
Yeah, really, really, really good stuff. Could really do this for a long time personally, but you gotta call it at some point.
Yeah,
wait.
great.
We want to do jobs. Is anyone who's hiring and who's looking for a job?
Oh yeah, so we're hiring. My company, defmethod.com. I'll put it in the chat, and you can find us anywhere. As I mentioned, am personally leading recruiting right now because that's how much we are kind of growing. We're not a startup. We're a bootstrapped company. We've got we've got money in the bank and stability. we've never laid anybody off. We pay market rates, and everybody works a 40-hour work week. It's a nice place to come and spend part of your career. So give it a shot.
Are you a remote company?
We are a remote first company, so we do still have an office in New York. I'm there sometimes, but there are plenty of people now. We've hired people across 8 different states. There are people I've never met in person, and that's just fine. They're great, and so we're going to continue to lean into it. We do great work remotely, and so we're going to keep doing that.
Cool. Anyone else?
Phil Wire is hiring. Sorry. So we are hiring pretty much all across the board. We're trying to double our team size by end of year. We're at 30-ish people right now, and we want to go even bigger next year. You'll see the link in the chat. We are remote friendly, remote in US or France. We're trying to go into